Hawthorne here, artist on Deadpool and Spider-Man, and we are going to draw Deadpool. So I put a cheat sheet up here for you guys, and I'll refer to each of these points as I'm working. But I want to have you guys be able to take note here, and hopefully it's relatively clear and you can understand it all. So I'm going to do a pretty basic standing pose, and to do that, I want to start with a really basic center line. So I'm going to base the entire figure off of that. Um, Human figure is relatively symmetrical, so it's often a good idea to start relatively uh, straightforward with a center line. So I'm also going to decide in advance how tall the figure is. And the reason for that's going to make some sense in a minute here. And so when we start drawing, whenever we're talking about drawing, we often talk about proportions and how big to make something, how tall to make a figure. And the easiest way to measure things is with heads. So for a more heroic proportioned character, I tend to go with 8 heads. So 8 heads tall. It also makes it easier to separate it into chunks. So it would be 4 heads for the upper body, 4 heads for the lower body. And you want to find the halfway point. Now you can kind of eyeball it, or you can use your pencil to figure it out. But if you're feeling a little stuck, you can do a little cheat sheet here. And I'm just using a piece of paper. And I'm going to mark off where I had my little mark earlier. And this will give me a pretty easy way to figure out my halfway point. So that fold is the halfway point. I'm going to make a mark on my paper. Whoops, let's move that down a little bit. So that fold is my halfway point. Okay? Now, if I want to split these up into the 4 heads that we talked about, all I have to do is fold this 2 more times. So I'm folding it there for half, that's 2 heads, and then 1 for 1 head. Now you don't have to do this every time, but it might make it easy for you if you're sort of coming at this for the first time and you want to really get the measurements right. So now we have the top half of the figure. So 1, 2, 3, 4 heads tall there. If I want to cheat, I can just make marks on my paper. So it's sort of a human proportions ruler here. Okay, now 5, 6, 7, 8 for the lower body. Okay, now you don't have to do this every time, it's just so that you get used to the proportions. So I'm going to kind of rough in very lightly some of the figure, and I'm going to try to use really basic shapes. So we tend to have, at Marvel, we like to draw pretty heroic looking characters, and they tend to be wider at the shoulder than normal and pretty narrow at the waist. One rule of thumb is to make a male character 2 shoulders wide, or rather the shoulders are 2 heads wide, and then 1 head wide at the waist. That's pretty exaggerated, but it works pretty good for superheroes, okay? So that halfway point is just about where the hips and crotch would be. And then this halfway point, so let's call this a quarter, is where the knee would be. So we have 4 heads for the legs, 2 heads for the bottom of the leg, 2 heads for the top. And I'm just going to work loose. I should also mention I'm just using a basic HB pencil. HB is pretty much like your standard school pencil, number 2, the thing that most of you probably use at school. So I'm going to really loosely block in the shapes of the figure, okay? You can kind of think of the legs as kind of a drumstick shape, especially the lower leg can really look like a kind of a cartoon drumstick. Now, the hips are generally wider than the waist, and as a rule of thumb, we'll make the hips about as wide as the chest is. And I'm going to block in some rough shapes. So I'm kind of using these lines to base where the chest is going to be. So that first head is there. The next head down, so number 2, I'm going to use that as a guideline for where roughly the chest would be. This would be roughly where the navel would be, and just below that is the waist. Make sense so far? Okay, let's put some arms on this guy, because you can't have Deadpool without arms. So I'm going to block in this leg, because believe it or not, you kind of need the leg to figure out where the arm is going to be. I want to bring that hand down to about mid-thigh here. So real basic shape. Rule of thumb, the arm is about 3 heads long, from armpit to the middle finger, the end of the middle finger, which is your longest finger. I'm going to see this line here. I'm going to use that as my basis for where the elbow is. Let's have Deadpool giving us the peace sign. What do you think? All right, so I'm going to foreshorten this arm here. You probably have heard of foreshortening. So it's basically when you see something like this sort of facing at you, you have to alter the shape. So if we go back to that drumstick shape, you can kind of think of it as a foreshortened drumstick. So next time you're eating lunch or something, look at it, and that might help you figure out how to draw a foreshortened arm. So now that I have everything kind of blocked in, I'm going to start defining the forms here. I'm going to bring that rib cage and waist straight up, and then have that nice tapered, wide, sort of V shape down towards the waist. And don't be afraid to be messy. I promise you, most of your favorite comics are a mess until they're tightened up and sent out to a printer for you guys to enjoy. So we mentioned we want to have the hips about as wide as the chest there. Yes, men have hips. You have to account for that. So I'm going to bring this up to about the middle point of the figure. You probably noticed I'm laying in where the waist is going to be, just because we're going to have to put his little belt on him later, so I want to keep that in mind. So Deadpool has these kind of forearm bands that I'm sort of blocking in here as I draw the foreshortened forearm. So far, so good. So he has this kind of separate section on his upper arm that separates the black from the red part of his costume. So I'm kind of dropping that line in, and I'm going to drop that here also. It tends to go down, the more modern design of Deadpool goes down the upper body to about the halfway point of the thigh and cuts over. So I'm going to draw his leg in without the boot, just so I can kind of get the basic shape of it down. And I'll draw the his shin guard and stuff onto it later. One thing to notice with the foot, it tends to have a straight side on the inside of the figure and flares out on the outside. So I'm going to block in his shin guard here. Deadpool wears shin guards, so like, he doesn't hurt his shins when he's riding a bike with his kid. All right, so I'm going to just use this. So this is where that center line comes into play. You've probably noticed I've purposely drawn everything on the left side, just so you can get a sense of the rough building that goes into the final drawing, and how I've used the measurement of the heads to get all my proportions right. So I can go back to that original head. And the head is just the easiest thing to measure with, because because you can kind of decide in advance how big you want to make it, and you can alter your drawing to match that, or you can just do like I did in advance, decide this is how tall I want to make my figure, and subdivide it with your little handy dandy paper ruler. So I'm going to subdivide that head into half in terms of its vertical measurement. So the reason for that is I want to place his eyes. And the eyes are usually, the brow is just about at the halfway point of the head. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and it's kind of small here, but you want to think of the head as being 5 eyes wide. One thing I'll see often from student artists is they'll set the eyes too far apart on Deadpool. So you want to be thinking about what the head looks like underneath the mask, and make sure you have, roughly an eye in between the 2 actual eyes you're going to draw. So I'm going to make his neck about as thick as his head. Again, it's a more athletic, heroic looking proportion. And it just suits the character. I'm also going to use, besides that HB pencil, I'm going to use a kneaded eraser just to clean things up a little bit. All right, so let's start putting his gear on. I'm going to drop in his harness that he wears that he keeps his swords on. I'll show you a trick for getting those swords placed correctly. So you want to pay attention to these lines here. These are collarbones, and they'll help you sort of define where the top edge of the chest is going to be. Also, you want to be thinking about where you're going to place his pouches on his belt. I tend to think of them as like boxes, like this. It's just easier to place them on the belt, and then I'll kind of, especially with a drawing like this that's a little more symmetrical, I can use that as that first one as a guideline for drawing the other ones. And I'll erase some of that construction line we had underneath. I like to draw the seams on his mask. I think it looks cool. So some people draw the little nub on his back of his mask. You may or may not see it from the front. I'll also sort of hint at his ears being on the side, just because I like it to look like it's an actual guy in a mask. Makes it a little more believable to me. So let's draw that other arm here. So again, I'm going to draw the arm as if he's not wearing his gear just yet. And I'll drop the gear on him in a second. So basic forearm, and he wears these sort of forearm guards. I'm going to drop in, and I'll get rid of some of these construction lines. I'll move that over a little bit. All right. What do you guys think? So far, so good? Okay, so we'll sharpen that up a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about the swords. Imagine you could see onto the back of him, and I tend to think of the swords crossing the center point on his back. So I'm going to draw an X kind of roughly through the figure. And this gives me sort of a starting point for where I'm going to put those swords on his back. And the reason I like to do that is because sometimes from certain angles you can see the other side of the sheath that's holding the sword. So it just makes it easier for me to have those points match up and then erase out the construction lines later. So at this point, we have pretty much all the construction done. And we can start adding in some detail, make this guy a little more recognizable as our favorite merc with the mouth. I'm going to fix up his mask a little bit. Keep your pencil sharp. The reason I like HB is it's soft enough, an HB pencil I mean, to erase later. If you have a very hard lead pencil, it can sometimes leave grooves in your paper that are difficult to erase. I will sometimes work with a slightly harder pencil, but for blocking in shapes, HB is a pretty good bet. If you go too dark of a pencil, it can get pretty smudgy. So I'm adding in these little details from his uniform here. So at this point, I want to just block in the last of the details here. So once you have all the forms down, you can start. Oh, I almost missed it. Why didn't anybody tell me? Look at this. I almost missed that spot. All right, so at this point, I'd probably start adding in some darks to figure out where I would want the inker or if I'm just inking myself, what parts to make black. I'm going to pretend like there's a light source coming this way, so there's shadows on the right side of the figure and highlights on the left side. I'm using the side of my pencil just so I can darken in areas relatively quickly. You wouldn't necessarily do this for a comic, or if you're going to ink it, just because you want to be able to translate this stuff to a black and white pen or brush. But I just want to show you guys roughly where I would put some of the black areas before we move on. At this point too, I'd probably start adding even more detail if that's what you want to do. So I'm going to add little buckles and seams to things. You might have noticed I put a button down on the one pouch down here. The level of detail is kind of a taste thing. You may not want a lot of detail in your drawing. You may want it. It really is up to you. There's no right or wrong. Um, a ton of detail does not equal a better drawing, but it might make you happy when you're working on it to throw detail on it. So by all means, have fun. So when I'm darkening in the area around the eyes, I tend to think of it as like the actual eye. So I have shadows under where the brow and stuff would be. And he has these kind of buckles on his neck here. And I'm gonna do a little checker pattern on the sword, just because I think it looks cool. Deadpool is all about his brand, so he likes to have his face on his belt buckle here. And kind of add a little Deadpool symbol. Needs a zipper, because everyone goes potty, right? And I like the small details in the clothing just because it to me makes him feel a little more believable. It's kind of like the buttons on the pouches. You want to be able to convince folks that he is actually keeping things in those pouches and he can access them. You want to have buckles on the harness here so it looks like it's actually makes sense that it's on him. A big part of this stuff is just going for believability. You want the folks looking at your drawing to go, oh yeah, that makes sense. So I mentioned that the light source is coming from this way, so I'm making this side of the figure darker, the shadow side. Let's do his eye here. So with the arms, you have a pretty rounded cylindrical form. So I tend to shade it like that, so it has kind of a highlight um, and then a dark side and a light side. All right, let's clean this up a little bit. Just drawing his boots a little bit here. So I'm going to have a shadow at the front of the boot here, and then kind of a highlight as it goes down the form. Same on this side. erase out part of the toe. And he has these kind of extra protective sections on his shin guards, and then we tend to put these little lines down the front of the shin guard. If you're ever feeling stuck with how to draw a hand, don't be afraid to look up some reference for anything. It's another thing that you'd be surprised how many pros use reference for their work. I just made this up, but if I was in a pinch and I wasn't sure how to, draw something, I would look up reference. Not so much for the figure anymore, just because I haven't drawn it so much, but you have to look up reference every so often for how to draw a car or a building or whatever. So there's no shame in it. It's all study. It's all going to make your drawing better. So don't be afraid to look up reference for how to draw things. Or if you don't have a reference, you can even pose out, ask a friend, or take a picture of your own hand. So that's the basic gist of it. Let me block in this sword here. So again, let's review the points here as we go down the illustration. You want to start with a center line, and even if you're going to draw an action pose, you often have a line of action that goes through the whole pose. So it's easy with a static drawing like this that you start with a pretty straight center line, and then you find a halfway point. So you have an idea of how to draw your figure so that the proportions match what you're going for. Then you want to think about sort of that heroic 8 heads tall set of proportions for a more heroic Marvel character. Obviously, in the real world, most folks are not 8 heads tall. If you're like me, you're probably more like 5 heads tall. But it makes it easier for comics because you can separate the lower body and the upper body into really basic 4 heads. Now, if any of you guys ever go to art school, you might get taught the proportions being slightly smaller. This is basically just an exaggerated one for superhero characters. And 2 heads wide at the shoulders, just about a head wide, maybe a little wider at the waist. And if you're drawing straight on, remember you can make the hips about as wide as the chest. It's a really easy way to figure out how to get the proportions right on the entire figure. And that's pretty much it, guys. Let's get some of the last details here. Maybe do a little more shading. Let me sharpen my pencil. Add a little hatching. So hatching is just when you do shading where you have lines, and then you can do cross hatching like that. So we'll sometimes add a little hatching just to build a form, just to give it some depth, add some shadows that are not completely black. And that's about it, guys. So remember, keep it really, really simple. Think about these basic forms. Think of the drumstick we talked about for kind of a basic form for parts of the leg and the forearm. Remember that you want to have that taper in the upper body. And then kind of a widening at the hips that's as wide as the chest. And then you can build your legs onto that. Remember, once you have your center line, you want to think of the shoulders as being 2 heads wide. And the feet tend to be straight on the inside of the form and flare out at the outside. That's it. Thanks for watching, guys. I believe we're going to do another one of these on Instagram, so you should check the Marvel Instagram feed. We're going to do one on drawing the head. But for now, this is Mike Hawthorne, Deadpool artist, and be safe out there, and peace.